Afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the life of a wise judge, a good man, a wonderful human being. It seems altogether appropriate that we have come together today to remember this light that has been taken out of our lives on the shortest day, the darkest day of the year. I'm Thomas Reynolds. I first knew John and Betty back in 1986 when I came out west to be editor and publisher of California Lawyer magazine and the San Francisco Daily Journal. I soon sought out Betty's book, Framed, to help make sense of what was going on down the block at the California Supreme Court, and we became friends. Fortunately, that friendship has lasted, and as many of you in this room know, whether you first know Betty or you first know John, you soon know both of them, and double your pleasure. And happily, our friendship has endured. We have visited them in New York in their apartment overlooking the Flatiron Building and Madison Square Garden. You may know that since he was 80, there's a plaque on a bench for John in that park that says, "From PS 86 to California and back. Loving dad, grandpa, husband, friend, great California Court of Appeal justice." You will hear from some of John's family and friends and professional colleagues, and some who fit more than one of those categories today. But first, let's hear from his children. Chris Racanelli, John Racanelli, Karen Racanelli, Lori Racanelli, and Tom Racanelli. Chris?
It's been over 2 months since my dad took his final breath. In his honor, I would like to share some memories and say a few words. First, I want to thank my dad, John Racanelli, for adopting me. I doubt if I ever said this to him during his life, and I hope he understood this anyway. As a child, I was constantly in trouble at school. In first grade, it was decided that if I was good for a week, no hitting, swearing, or cutting in line, Dad would come into my class and take me out to lunch. This was a big deal for me, and the following week, there was a marked improvement in my behavior. I still remember Dad walking into my classroom in front of all my classmates in a serious suit and tie, looking like Perry Mason and smelling of Old Spice cologne. I was one proud boy. We went to what I thought was a fancy restaurant, a diner, and had bacon, lettuce, and tomato sandwiches. I was always proud of my dad's abilities. He was energetic, smart, charming, and charismatic. I heard him speak in public for the first time when I was in 5th grade. It was at my Boy Scout spaghetti dinner. There were a few hundred people. He stood up and spoke confidently and eloquently, and everybody listened. I was in awe. In my early years, Dad was a very busy man who was often out late, going to meetings all the time. We met Governor Edmund Brown of California and many other important people. His life changed when he was appointed to the San Jose Superior Court. When I was in high school, Dad transitioned into being a Superior Court judge. Dad had many worldly achievements, but his greatest attainment was his loving, kind, and joyful nature. He taught me that goodness, justice, and fairness is a practice one must always work towards. Helping people came naturally to him, and this was far more important to him than making money. It was in 1996 when I was living in San Diego that Dad suffered an equilibrium stroke and needed help. Betty called to ask if I could stay with him as she was unable to get out of a commitment in New York. In that short period, Dad and I developed an emotional attachment, maturity and trust, and our father-son relationship deepened. And when he moved to New York, the last 20 years had a very positive and important influence on me. We spent more one-on-one time together, cementing our closeness. We came to know and love New York City just like he did. These years were very special to me. I discovered his love of life, his love of diversity, his keen interest in the arts, theater, music, and comedy. I came to value his gentleness, his expansiveness, his generosity and openness. The growth of our relationship, the warmth and appreciation, is something I will always treasure and will deeply miss. Finally, it was in the last stages of his life when his body was breaking down and his frailties and vulnerabilities were evident that Dad showed the courage to express his love to his wife, family, and friends. In his final month, I was able to help Betty care for Dad till the very end. That morning, Dad had breakfast. We were talking, even joking, when all of a sudden he closed his eyes and went to sleep. I am honored to witness the culmination of a very large life and very special relationship. Thanks, Dad.
2 years ago, at his 90th birthday, my dad and many of you, I stood before my dad and many of you and tried to describe our complicated relationship of 60 years. I talked about his values of integrity, justice, honor, and fairness, his love of good food and wine, his compassion for those less fortunate, his willingness to speak up for the voiceless. I talked about his judgment, for Dad was a judge in every sense of the word. As many of you know, his judgments were rendered both in the courtroom and at home. In fact, thanks to him, my brothers and I became quite expert at acting as our own defense lawyers in the home. Well, let's let it go here. I also shared the many phases of our relationship over the years, how Dad had been alternately my hero, my role model, my rescuer, and eventually my mentor and true friend. In the 2 years since that day, as Dad's pace slowed and his mortality finally began to reveal itself to our disbelieving eyes, I realized there were many questions I had never asked him. So finally, I did ask. On a warm and relaxed Saturday last September, we sat in the sunny kitchen of their New York flat, Dad, Betty, and I posed every question a son, at least this son, could think to ask. Questions like, if you had the chance to do it all over again, what would you do differently? Is there any advice you'd wish you had given me back in those early years? What advice would you offer my son? What's your greatest regret and what are you most proud of? And then the hardest one, have your kids made you proud? And have I? There were many more, and I taped the entire encounter, with his permission, of course, although just to be safe, I did obtain a FISA warrant. In all, I recorded more than 2 hours of conversation, and I will now play it for you in its entirety. Well, while we're at it, let's just put his face up on the screen here more there. Forget it. Okay. It was an afternoon I'll never forget. It was among the best time that Dad and I had ever spent together, and as it turns out, it was our last time together. We shared a beer, we laughed, we got serious, and we looked back over his long, full, and amazing life. Some of that conversation was only ours to share, and I get to keep those memories myself. But much of what Dad said was incredibly insightful and poignant, and I think there's something in those words for every one of us who knew and loved John T. Racanelli. I'd like to share a few of them with you now. One of the first things I asked was, what do you wish you'd done differently? Without skipping a beat, he pointed at Betty and said, met her sooner. He went on to describe how his early years were driven by events not in his control. Between 18 and 30, He'd served in 2 wars as an Army Air Corps navigator, gone to college and law school at Cal and here at Hastings, started a law firm, first here in San Francisco and then in the wilds of Santa Clara Valley, where he began a family, an Italian-American family that numbered eventually 7, not counting, of course, the untold numbers of dogs, cats, rats, chickens, hamsters, turtles, and king snakes that shared that Eichler on Sesame Street in Sunnyvale. Several times he told me he wished he'd traveled more and written about it. He said, most of my writing skills went to legal briefs and opinions. I just wish I'd kept a journal and started traveling much earlier in life and not on B-17s. I asked about his advice for Pearson and the rest of the grandkids. He said, travel, especially when you're young and have your freedom. Get to know people who are not like you. Always extend your range of friendships. Never stop making new friends and never give up on old ones. As you get older, they become more and more important and scarce. I mentioned my teen years, which were nothing if not troubled, and I asked if he ever just gave up on me, if he ever thought I was a lost cause. He said, no, I was disappointed, but never disillusioned. I knew at some point you'd figure things out and correct your course. You just needed time to get it right. Dad always thought like a navigator. For him, life was a journey. I asked what advice he would offer my siblings and I, and he said, don't get too caught up in the swirl of life. Find the time to share your life with those important to you. Never stop educating yourself, whether it's in school or out of it, everywhere. Find yourself a good mate, one who's your friend, lover, helper, and soulmate. It makes everything a lot simpler. I admitted that like many members of this clan, I can be stubborn, a fact that my wife Susan often notes. I added, and she's not wrong about it. His response was very concise. They seldom are. 2 years ago, at his 90th, I told Dad I looked forward to celebrating his centennial, perhaps with another of Betty's special surprise parties, held every 10 years with a predictability that rivaled Halley's Comet. Time and circumstances didn't give us that chance, but today we celebrate you, Dad. You're just not here for us to see you, not in the flesh. But you are here in our hearts, and you always will be. I love you, I miss you, and as I have for the past 40 years, I will live my life in a way that I hope will always make you proud. Arrivederci, Babo.
Oh, you can clap for Johnny. Go ahead, he's used to it. Hi, I'm Karen, the eldest daughter, and thank you all for being here. I'm the only child that has remained in the Bay Area of the family, so I have a lot of special friends here, and I thank you for all your love and support over the years and through this difficult time. Just over 2 months ago, my dad, Babo, was alive. Not strong, not vibrant, but alive. I could call him at his home in New York, talk to him about his grandkids, hear his voice, ask him how he was feeling that day, tell him I loved him. I was moored. On October 12th, I lost my mooring. The man who I've known my best in my whole life and admired for over 50 years was gone. I said goodbye to his wisdom, his gentle nature, his kindness, his wry humor, his commitment to social justice, and his love. These qualities aren't a surprise to you. You all knew Dad. You too were captivated by his joie de vivre, brightened by his infectious grin, inspired by his love for Betty, or endured one of his many stories. Everywhere we went over the years, people wanted to meet my dad. My friends, my kids' teachers, shopkeepers in Italy. When Dad and Betty heard that the Sicilian ceramicist De Simone was coming to San Francisco, they invited him to their home on Green Street, where their kitchen was peppered with playful De Simone tiles. He and Babo instantly hit it off, il professore ed il giudice. In their broken communication, they talked food, justice, and art. And De Simone, in turn, invited us to his daughter's wedding in Palermo, Sicily, the following year. When I met up with Dad and Betty in Sicily, Dad's purse was stolen on day one by a pickpocket on a motorbike, of course. So we ended up at a local police station, me, Babbo, and 6 or 7 carabinieri. They listened intently as Dad described every card and document that was in his wallet, as they asked for. And I did my best to translate it to Italian. And soon enough, Dad had forgotten all about the crime and was instead focusing on the telling of the story. The coup de grace was when they asked him, as a judge, what would he do to such a criminal in his country? And Dad looked up, his eyes widened, and then, and of course, laughter. Only Baba. It wasn't always easy for my dad. He and my mom raised 5 kids spanning 12 years, and it took its toll on them. The teenage shenanigans that we all, well, some of us, you've heard from them, engaged in didn't always go hand in hand with the law and Dad's position as a judge in town. At college, I declared myself a theater major, which at that time wasn't really an easy pill for my dad to swallow. When he'd introduce me to friends and colleagues, he'd say I was majoring in theater. And then clearly add, with a minor in scientific perspectives, which was true, but anyway, when Dad met Betty, his whole life brightened. He was still deeply committed to his work, but now he had a smart and exuberant partner with whom he could share his passion for justice and equity. Together they learned to cook, took up mountain biking, explored Italy and Denmark, and covered their home in colorful, beautiful art, and entertained all of us in their homes, first in San Francisco and then in New York, with vibrant, joyful, political dinner parties where red wine was abundant and laughter prevailed. I've met some of the most intelligent and interesting people over the years at those dinner parties, and my association with so many of you stems from those occasions provided me by Dad and Betty. And although Dad asked why on earth I was dating a lawyer when he learned of my interest in my paramour then, Beau, he relished the honor of marrying us some 26 years ago on the docks of the Dolphin Club in San Francisco. And they developed a very strong affection for each other over the years with a shared philosophy in progressive politics. And I find it no mistake that the very qualities I've come to love in my husband are some of the same that I loved and miss about my dad. My last strong memory of Dad is sitting with him on the balcony of their Gramercy flat, enjoying the sun and a breeze and the sounds of New York City. My brother Chris and my sister Lori were both there. And I somehow managed to spill Dad's beer on the table. So Lori and Chris and I jumped up and grabbed rags and we were frantically wiping up. And I looked up and Dad was not only smiling, but laughing so heartily. And I said, Dad, are you laughing at me? And he smiled and said, Carrie, it's only beer. 91 years is a long time, and it represents a full life. Not for 1 minute do I take that for granted. Dad lived fully, he loved fully, he was loved passionately by Betty and devotedly by his children and grandchildren, and I know by so many of you. We are all beneficiaries of Dad's time on this planet. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lori, the youngest daughter, the only other one. In memory of Dad, I'd like to first share a poem in the words of St. Augustine, which remind me of Dad. Love never disappears, for death is a non-event. I have merely retired to the room next door. You and I are the same. What we were for each other, we still are. Speak to me as you always have. Do not use a different tone and do not be sad. Smile and think of me. Life means what it has always meant. The link is not severed. Why should I be out of your soul if I am out of your sight? I'll wait for you. I am not here, but just on the other side of this path. You see, all is well. In memory of Dad, I want to share some things. I know I could stand here and tell you all what a great man he was. I know you know that. But I would like to share some memories of the lessons that Dad taught us in life. Dad was a man of lessons. To teach us not to smoke, Dad would take a big puff of his cigarette and blow it through his handkerchief to show the nicotine and tobacco. So we could see that ring and then not want to smoke. To teach us not to drink soda pop, Dad would take one of our tooth that one of us lost and soak it in a clear glass of Coke so we could watch it rot. To teach us to try not to get in trouble with the law, Dad took us down to juvenile hall and had us fingerprinted. It didn't work on my brothers. And then there was Dad's famous quote that we all know and love. I cried when I had no shoes until I saw the man that had no foot. And that's stayed with all of us. Some of the wonderful memories that stand out in my mind were the way Dad couldn't remember which of us he was mad at. So he would combine all of our names in anger. Jacques Lota, Chris! And often the dog, Bridget. That's a huge joke for all of us. He would always also, the memory I have, when my mother would travel, Dad would make Joe's special, which was hamburgers, spinach, and eggs. But the memory I have that stands out the most was when he made Joe's special on the stove in a plastic pot. That was a melted disaster. I remember the time we went to Tahoe. We would always go to Tahoe, and our headlights went out on our old country Squire. And Dad convinced Carrie and I to sit in the back seat with a flashlight and blink it for hours to ward off the traffic. And we did it. I will always treasure my memories as a young adult. My family and I, my kids and I, and my husband traveling to San Francisco to stay with Dad and Betty, and our wonderful trips, long walks on Stinson Beach, the foot-long hot dogs that Dad would relish afterwards. I remember my kids making pasta. Dad made homemade pasta with my children in his tall chef's cap. I'll always treasure those memories. I remember meeting Dad early in the morning when I would travel to San Francisco on business at the Dolphin Club to go for a row. And he would fill me with his wisdom for the day. Those are treasured memories. Dad taught me a lot of things. I think mostly to believe in myself and to know that I could achieve anything that I believed I could. And I believe I will see him again. I believe he's here with us. I will see him again in heaven, and I look forward to the time that I can see him. I want to thank you all for coming and for being here with us to share in the loving memory of Dad.
We're endeavoring to activate the slideshow.
Well, that's fine if it stops right there. I'm Tom, and I'm Dad's youngest son. And I wanted to mention that we all know Dad by different roles. And he's a role of a husband, a father, grandfather, of course, friend, and justice of the law. But I would like to discuss one other role. And it's very appropriate that John changed the picture to land on this one, because the role that I want to discuss is his role as a sailor. And to do that, I'm going to read a short blurb from the book I wrote about Dad. And then I'm going to read a poem that I wrote in memory of him called Sail On. So first I'll read a brief excerpt. Dad enjoyed the ocean so much that he invested in a sailboat. I remember his first boat as a small one, which we sailed in a nearby lake in the Santa Clara Valley. But soon Dad graduated to the big leagues and he bought an Olson 31-footer. This was a real sailboat with a galley, several portholes, and a decent-sized mast. I imagine it cost a lot of money because Dad went in on it with partners. Nevertheless, our family got our fair share of use out of that boat. We would sail it frequently on the weekends, getting up early to make the trek to the docks, take care of the necessary prep work, and then sail away. Lots of times the winds would be strong enough to cause the boat to heel, and we would all sit up on the high side watching the water swish by and hoping not to capsize. Dad always said, one hand for you and one for the boat, meaning always to keep a grip on a lanyard, rail, or other part of the boat to keep from falling overboard. The effect of these sails was exhilarating. There was something about being out on the open sea with no motor sound, just the sound of the water, the wind, and the beating of the sun, which appeals to our natural disposition. Such was the case with these sailing excursions that our family took. And this poem is called Sail On. We are gathered here to bid thee well, and for this moment our love to tell. We see in you a lot of things, a heart for justice, a life that sings. You had a way of hanging in there when the times were tough and the threads were bare. Perhaps it was the times you knew, the Great Depression and World War II. Nevertheless, you stood up straight and met your destiny, seized your fate. This led you to some foreign lands, college and law school with their demands. Eventually, you settled down to practice law in a small town. There you raised your family, Chris, John, and Carrie, Lori, and me. Your life then took another turn when Betty Metzger's love you earned. Your rocket ship from there did seem to blast off high to space extreme. The two of you set sail together, hand in hand, to meet life's weather. Around the globe your love took you on grand adventures of life anew. With stealth and skill, Betty surprised you and marked the years your bond had grew to. Your rocket landed with great glee to your childhood home, New York City. Dad, you were a sure tall tree who shaded many, including me. I love you, Dad. May your rocket continue its blast through space and to where your keen sense of justice takes you. Sail on. Thank you.
John's 6 grandchildren and great-grandchild are with us today, and we'll hear from 2 of his grandchildren. First, Jonathan Kirby, and then Cassidy Bogatin.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. When I think about what he meant to me, the list is much too long to share here today. But a couple distinct things stand out for the lasting impact they had. He taught me the meaning of hard work and putting your best foot forward each day to better yourself. And if you're lucky, which he certainly was, have a positive impact on those around you. He did this by telling me stories of his father, which I believe he'd want me to share today. His father came over from Italy at the age of 18, worked on the railroad, served in the military, worked as an ice and coal man in New York City, and later in California, loading bakery trucks during the night shift, all to provide for his family and give them better opportunities than he had. I think it's safe to say that he did a pretty good job. It was easy to see the impact that he had on my grandfather, who went on to serve in the military himself and ultimately serve as a judge on the California Court of Appeal, which I'm sure all of you know. His decisions, some of which still have an impact today, aim to create a better, more accepting world and create better situations for those around him, much like his father did for him. He also taught me to be compassionate towards my fellow man and to be more accepting of those around me, no matter the differences between us. Growing up in the South, in Texas, we weren't always around people who had this same feeling. His discussions he would have with me, most of which were at a cafe or a deli after a museum or art gallery visit to culture me up a little bit, really helped shape me and turn me into the registered Democrat I am today. Thank you. For being not so close geographically, I am extremely fortunate to have had the relationship with him that I did. It is something I will cherish and often relive for the rest of my life. Whether it's the walks we had through the city, making pasta from scratch in San Francisco, fishing off the coast of Connecticut, and being the only ones not to get sick, going to a Yankees Red Sox game, and I was probably too young to hear the language said there, having my first glass of whiskey with him at a bar to give Grandma just a little bit more stall time for the surprise parties. Early morning conversations around the table that would soon turn into early afternoon lessons, or sharing a beer on the balcony. I will always be grateful for the time we spent together and will always wish there could have been more. I know I could never articulate what having him in my life means to me and the impact he had on everyone he touched in a way that he deserves, but I appreciate having the opportunity to try. The last thing he ever said to me, leaned forward, hand on my shoulder, with that serious look on his face that makes you listen intently to every word that he says, was take care of yourself, kid, and I'll keep trying, Grandpa.
Sorry, you might have noticed that I have a rather large book with me, and it is called The Selected Opinions of Presiding Justice John T. Racanelli from June 1977 to 1991. While I would love to read all of it right here, right now, I'm afraid I can't do that. So I'll turn to one case in particular. Allow me to set the stage. 4 people are having a conversation late at night in a predominantly black San Francisco neighborhood. One of them is white, the other 3 are African American. So the group's obviously nefarious racial diversity has aroused the suspicion of a police officer who performs a pat-down and makes an arrest. And I'll turn it over to Justice Racanelli. In short, the officer reasoned from past experience that only a white person bent on criminal misdeeds would be present anywhere in that predominantly black area during nightfall. The implications of such an astonishing revelation are profoundly disturbing. If such subjective determination by the officer were all that is required to justify detention, then conceivably any white citizen observed in such large urban area after sunset, no matter how innocent the purpose, would be subject to police detention. Moreover, the corollary and more startling implication of such inflexible reasoning, that any black person associating at night with a white person must either be attempting a robbery or a sale of narcotics, is simply intolerable. Now, none of you should be surprised to figure out that my grandfather was on the right side of history on that one. But you might be surprised to learn that his opinion was a dissenting one. And the majority actually ruled in favor of the legality of the officer's search, even though it was conducted on the basis of racial profiling. I expect you'll hear a lot today about my grandfather's many victories, as you should. But I'm told a good justice lives on through their decisions. I don't know much about that. What I do know is that a good person lives on through their principles. Leafing through this book, I found myself drawn to those occasions when Babo's voice was not the loudest, his opinion was relegated to the back page of the case, just under the stenographer's notes. And there it said, John T. Racanelli, I respectfully dissent. I respectfully dissent. My grandfather was fiercely moral. He was tolerant. He was humble. He was bitingly intelligent, but he was never condescending. He was fiercely opinionated, but he knew how to listen. And even when Baba was wrong, wait, sorry, that's a typo. The man was never wrong. I'm reminded of the words of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who tells us to disagree without being disagreeable. She tells us to fight for what we care about, but to do it in a way that will lead others to join us. Because dissenters do not write for today. We write for tomorrow. Now, if you Googled the People vs. Bauer, you would find that the decision was actually overturned a few years after Baba's opinion. Someone somewhere once said that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice, something like that. I would hope that we can remember that message during these days. And when you're feeling down, you can just tell yourself, I respectfully dissent. Thank you.
Next, we'll hear tributes from John's professional colleagues and from friends. Sometimes that's the same group. First, Susan Miner, lead staff attorney while John was on the Court of Appeal.
Some of you may not know that Justice Racanelli was known at the Court of Appeal affectionately as the Rack. And those of us on the court staff who worked most closely with him called ourselves the Rackettes. That included me, Gretchen Strain, his research attorney, Martha McGee, his secretary, Lynn Armstrong, our central staff attorney, Susan Horst, our writ attorney, Julie Begoy, and Joan Taylor, our Division I clerks. I'm speaking today on behalf of all the Rackettes when I say that working for Justice Racanelli was not just an honor and a privilege, but also a joy. Now, personally, I wasn't so sure at the beginning. I found him rather intimidating. He seemed kind of formal and a little gruff, but it was very clear very soon that he was just the opposite. He was a kind and gentle man who was easy to laugh with and easy to work with. He was always patient, he was always thoughtful, and he was always respectful. That respect went beyond just his own staff. In his role as the presiding justice of Division I and the administrative presiding justice of the entire First District, he showed the same respect to everyone, from the janitor to the Chief Justice, from the pro per litigant to the high-priced lawyer. And respect traveled both ways. All of us who knew him admired him and were inspired by him for his sharp mind, his keen interest in politics and world affairs, and of course, most importantly, his devotion to fairness and justice, so evident in his opinions. But we Rackettes did have one little complaint, and that was his vocabulary. We called it Rackies. From our perspective, we would submit draft opinions written in plain English, and he would try to edit them into this flowery, complex language, Rackies. Now, some might say flowery and complex sounds kind of like a wine, maybe an Italian wine. And we do know the judge liked to eat well. unless you count the Juji fruit candies that he kept in his desk. But he definitely fed us well. He hosted delicious lunches at restaurants, Italian and otherwise, and at his home with Betty, where he served us homemade pasta. As a host, he was generous and sociable, charming and funny. One year at our holiday lunch, he gave us all Christmas ornaments that represented some case we had worked on. I got a tiny boat for the water case. Gretchen got one dangly earring for a sex discrimination case. It was a silly, sweet, endearing gesture, but it illustrates the bigger gift that Judge Racanelli gave to all of us. He made us feel valued and trusted and proud of our work. And that's the gift we all carry with us. When the judge retired in 1991, the Rackettes had T-shirts made for ourselves that said, "I survived the rack." I once wore that shirt in public, and a stranger came up to me and said, "What's the rack? Is it an amusement park ride?" Well, I'm not going to draw that analogy, but I will say that working for Judge Racanelli was a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. And we all will be forever grateful that we had the chance to know him, to learn from him, and be a part of his remarkable life. Thank you.
Please welcome Joe Groden, a former colleague of John's on the Court of Appeal, former California Supreme Court Justice, and a law professor here at Hastings.
Okay. It's been 40 years since I reported for duty as an associate justice in Division I, District 1 of the California Court of Appeal. Met my new colleagues, Norman Elkington, Bill Newsom, and our presiding justice, John Racanelli. I was excited. I was filled with anticipation, but I had little inkling that I was about to embark on what would be the most rewarding time of my legal career. I'd met John only once before when I was introduced to him by a man we both loved and admired, Justice Matthew Tabriner. Matt described John to me as a first-rate lawyer, first-rate judge, first-rate human being in such glowing terms that I thought there must be at least a modicum of exaggeration. But in my first week with Division I learned that everything that Matt described was entirely correct. I was new to the judiciary, and John proceeded to mentor me with a spirit of generosity and patience and intelligence and humor that I came to recognize as essential aspects of his character. He became a friend and an inspiration. John had a love for the law and a wonderful ability to understand and articulate legal concepts, but he also had a keen appreciation for the way that the law interacts with people. He had the vision, not common to all appellate judges, to see the human beings behind the law books. Some of his opinions will go down in those books as important precedent, and you will hear about some of those. Others, mostly unnoticed, will upon closer examination be revealed as evidence of his equally important humanity. There's one such case I'll not forget as long as I live. I warned Betty that if I talked about it, I was certain to express some emotion, but here goes. It's the case of Philip Becker. Philip was a young man with Down syndrome. His brain and body both worked slowly, and the doctors were worried that he might have a heart condition common to persons suffering from that disease that would result in an early death. His parents, believing that Philip had no future, placed him in an institution where he was taken care of, but they seldom visited him there. And they declined to consent to the exploratory cardiac surgery which the doctors recommended. Philip would have remained in the institution for the rest of his life, but for the intervention of a couple named Becker, who visited him there, invited him to stay with them at their home on weekends and with their children from time to time, and eventually sought formal custody. The custody was opposed by his natural parents. The trial court in San Jose, after a lengthy hearing, awarded them custody over the objection of his natural parents, and they appealed. The case was assigned to District 1, Division 1. The applicable legal principles were not in dispute. A child could be removed from the custody of his natural parents, but only on a showing that parental custody was actually detrimental to the interests of the child. What was in dispute was the application of that principle to the facts of the particular case. Let me read to you from the opening paragraph of Justice Racanelli's opinion. Few human experiences evoke the poignancy of a filial relationship and the pathos attendant upon the disruption in society's effort to afford every child a meaningful chance to live life to its fullest promise. This appeal, posing a sensitive confrontation between the fundamental right of parental custody and the well-being of a retarded child, reflects the deeply ingrained concern that the needs of the child remain paramount in the judicial monitoring of custody. Bottom line, the trial court's decision was affirmed. That was in 1981. Philip was then 14. Fast forward 14 years. It's 1991. John had announced his retirement, and Betty arranges a surprise retirement party for him, which we've heard about was a custom, at the Dolphin Club. My wife Janet and I were invited, so was Bill Newsom. As we arrive, we're greeted by Betty, who says there's someone at the party we might like to meet. She leads us to a table and introduces us to the Beckers and to Philip, who thanks us for the decision. We learned that Philip had the exploratory surgery the doctors had recommended, and everything was fine. We also learned that the young woman sitting next to him, apparently with Down syndrome as well, was his fiancée, and they're about to get married. The principal announced in John's opinion that the goal of the law is to afford every child a meaningful chance to live life to its fullest promise is about to be fulfilled. Just then, John arrives at the party and is ushered to the table. Philip is introduced. His new mother gives a short talk, introduces Judge Racanelli, and Philip pumps his fist up and down and shouts, "Yay, Judge Racanelli." I can't think of a better tribute. Yay, Judge Racanelli.
Please welcome Ernest Smith, who teaches at the University of Texas, a former colleague of Betty's at San Francisco State, a longtime friend of both John and Betty.
Welcome from a Lone Star State. Only place in the country that makes you feel sanguine about Trump is being in Texas, being in Texas. I didn't know John from his work. I knew John because of his Betty. The first time we met was actually when I came here to interview for the job in 1989. And we met at a dinner party at Betty's house because she did a lot of things at the house, social occasions, because San Francisco State had no money for anything. And I don't remember much about the dinner, but what I remember was two things. First of all, Ms., this oldest and most mangy cat I've ever seen in my life, and John, who was the youngest, old, and most woke white dude I'd ever met in my life. I'm like, who is this guy? And we would meet many times in those kind of occasions. And over the years, I have to say that we always met in the same way. It was always with Betty. It was always around the table. There was always homemade pasta, and there was always lots and lots of wine and the most stimulating conversation that you could have in your life. John, to me, was the kind of guy that when he spoke to you, you felt like he was like totally engaged in what you were saying, and you were just the most brilliant thing in the world. It was the most interesting thing in the world. Now, later on, I found out that some of it's because he was kind of hard of hearing, so he's kind of always leaning forward and paying attention. But it was always he always made me feel heard and seen, and therefore just a little bit more whole. And I think that was, for me, his gift. He was a wonderful guy to throw shade with. He was a wise man and a real wise guy. I mean, we laughed so much, he and I, about anything. I can't remember the things we laughed about. As I was racking my brain as I was thinking about speaking, saying, let me drop some words of wisdom that John told me over the years, and I couldn't think of anything. All I could think of was just how alive it felt simply to be with this man. So alive. But I want to end by telling you a story of his kindness. Everyone has spoke here about his kindness. In 1990 or 91, I can't remember, I had a hysterectomy. And at the time, well, I still am a lesbian, but at the time, I was in my first serious relationship and had been for years, and my mother had she had an issue with it. She was a bit, so there'd been a little tension between us over the years. And so she was coming out after the surgery, and Betty suggested, well, let's have a dinner party for your mother, and then she could see that, people like judges, and everything's like this, you're just completely not only normal, but the establishment here. And John was totally into, yeah, okay, let's have the dinner. Well, I don't think we had it. We ended up going to my house, and I lived on Page Street then. And I remember John and my mother sitting at the window, sitting underneath one of the lovely kind of four-corner windows they had, and there was a bench underneath it, and they were sitting there, and I look up, and my mother's just carrying on like she's on a date or something. It's like and it's just, they're going on like they've been together forever. And afterwards, I don't know if it made her feel any better about my, quote, lifestyle, but she did refer to him forever after that as that suave judge. And that's what I think of when I think of this man. There was a natural elegance about him, a grace, of a generosity of spirit, and this ability to just make you feel as if you mattered, and that we should live a life that mattered. The last time I saw John was 2 days after Trump got elected. It was actually my birthday. And I happened to be in New York, and I went by to see them we had a lovely dinner. We had the pasta again. And I've never been to a dinner party there where John, you remember your glass was never empty with John. There was no such thing as an empty glass of wine. You look up, it was there. You have to tell him, stop, John. But it was always full. So we're sitting there. There are protesters running around outside screaming about Trump. And I thought, this is just the perfect place to be 2 years after this election. And he gave me a very brief kind of erudite lecture about the racist history of the Electoral College, just very quickly. Then he, very quickly, it was real quick. It's like, thank you, John. And then he told me about being a navigator. I never knew he'd been a bomber or something. So he was like, the greatest generation. I knew he was, but I didn't know he'd done that. And then we talked quite a lot about Betty's book and how it was going to be, maybe it was going to be made into a movie. And I remember when I left, I just put my arms around him because in that particular moment, and it was a very, those few days after that was a hard time. And I remember I put my arms around him and I thought, it's gonna be all right. Because, in the end, it is his spirit and what he represents is going to live on. And that we have to have the strength to push through it. And every time I talked with John, I came back feeling just a little bit more in myself, just a little bit more with a sense of purpose and a sense of hope that this world could be a good place and a just place for everyone. And that is what I will take with me about John for the rest of my days. So thanks a lot for a chance to share.
Please welcome the former Executive Director and General Counsel of the Bar Association of San Francisco and the former Dean of Golden Gate University Law School, Drew Ramey.
Well, having heard Erna's remarks, I sort of second that emotion because I do think that John's mantra really could have been that Molly Ivins line a few of us were talking about before the proceedings, which is I much prefer somebody who burns the flag and wraps themselves in the Constitution than somebody who burns the Constitution and drapes themselves in the flag. John was not a Jewish person, at least so far as we know. But he might just well have been because he was the very personification of a maven, a macher, and a mensch. While he was, of course, a nonpareil judicial leader, I'm going to stick with some more of the personal, although I'll do somewhat of both. But what struck me the most in the times that we spent with John and Betty is that he adored Betty, he adored his family, and he enriched the lives of really countless friends. The Racanelli Metzger residences were just always crawling with friends. They knew every person in every building that they ever lived in, it seemed, and took them under their wing. They knew the most interesting people, whether it was a former justice of the South African Supreme Court or their cherished German family, or transplants like myself and my husband, Marvin Stender, who were so manifestly lucky to be embraced in the circle of warmth that it is to have been the FOJs and Bs. Others may talk about his extraordinary professional achievements, but I'd say that Marvin, who shared with John a penchant for women of substance, best summed up my feelings about John and Betty as follows. He said, I reflect mostly on the fact that we really didn't know them very well until we got to New York. And they were so incredibly gracious and so helpful in helping us to acclimate to the city. They became a really important part of our lives. He says, and I keep thinking, though, about the thing I didn't do with John, about which they talked endlessly, I thought, which was to find the headwaters of the Hudson River, something that Betty and I had less attention to. But Marvin said to me when I said I wanted to know what he thought about John, he said the thing that really amazed him about John was that he was a believer in the necessity and really the art of remaining absolutely stalwart in maintaining your progressive political positions, while at the same time not only being aware of but affirmatively giving recognition to the humanity of the people who disagreed with you. That quality, of course, might have been tested more lately, but what it really made him a magnificent judge. And that opinion, incidentally, is for the record, and it is both evidence-based and science-based. And if I could get in fetus diversity and transgender, I would be a happy woman in this talk. Senior Presiding Justice Tony Klein, who's here today, remembers John's uncanny ability as Administrative Presiding Justice of the First District Court to lower the temperature, disarm people, forge consensus, and generally make the court a whole lot nicer place to be. John, he said, was a great jurist who wrote some really important opinions, especially in the water area. He was a scholar, but a very sensitive person, he said. The single objective he had was to answer the question, was the judgment that was being challenged fair to the parties? And we heard something about one of the most poignant of such decisions. And he concluded by saying, I think he felt, with regard to the issues that came before us, that what we were doing was fashioning how society should be ordered. The fairness was what mattered to him. The Southern California Appellate News, upon Judge John's passing, I thought said it well when they said John was a man who would be remembered for putting humanity first, a justice whose decisions from 1977 to 1991 were as broad as changing all of state water law and as narrow as improving the life of one child. Now, upon retirement, John was no less a full participant in seeking justice, especially for the most vulnerable and marginalized. After the 2005 reelection of George Bush, which looks pretty damn good right now, actually, for example, there appeared in the Not in Our Name website an eerily prescient statement of conscience against war and repression, signed by a truly American cross-section, ranging from Wavy Gravy and Frank Serpico to Lenny Weinglass and one lone retired presiding justice of the California Court of Appeal, John Racanelli. In a statement redolent of today's atmosphere of sheer catastrophe, they declared, in the civil rights movement, we sat in Freedom Road, fought legal battles, filled jailhouses, and changed the face of a nation. We must change the political reality of this country by mobilizing the tens of millions. This will require creativity, mass actions, and individual moments of outrage. Well, not surprisingly, a little earlier, John and some other redoubtable high-level retired appellate justices like Cruz Reynoso had been excoriated by no less than Lyndon LaRouche for their petition for clemency for the Cuban Five, an act which ultimately played an important role in finally restoring, at least for now, diplomatic relations with Cuba. I can't even begin to imagine how many enemies lists John Racanelli was on, really. But moving from the professional to the personal, I spoke with Lovely Dillon, who was the former head of the California Minority Council program, and she remembers Betty saying how amazing John was during her health challenges. And Lovely said, the love that they had for each other was such an inspiration for me. They had the classic romance by which all loving relationships should be measured. Betty's a strong woman. Now, there's an understatement. She said, and there are some guys who just couldn't deal with that. But John was the first person to tell you all about Betty's signal achievements, just a class act all around. Lovely once asked John on the occasion of his 80th birthday, where many of you were in attendance, the key to aging well. And he said, the secret is you should never get comfortable. Anytime you feel like things are starting to get routine or normal, you need to shake things up. And so he did. Lovely, and Stephanie Wildman and Michael Tobriner, who would have been here if they weren't on an airplane, nailed it when they wrote to me of John that most of all, they would miss his smile. And not to say, of course, I would add, his wry wit, noted by one of his children, his kindness, his almost preternatural tolerance, and lifelong curiosity, and his eye for good people and great food. John was once interviewed for the California Appellate Court Legacy Project, and I read the entire oral history because it was so interesting. And among my favorite quotes was his memory of growing up in the Haight, where my husband and I have lived for the last 35 years. And when he was asked by Tim Reardon, what's the difference between the Haight of his childhood and the Haight of the 60s? John said, well, for one thing, he said, in those days, everyone wore shoes. My personal favorite anecdote in the oral history was John's memory of an early interchange with Justice Norm Elkington. And he was then, John was, a novice on the Court of Appeals. And he said, how do you know when you meet the Watson test and there is a miscarriage of justice that requires a reversal? At what point? What's the standard? And Elkington says, it's when you say it is. And when Justice Reardon asked him, how would you like to be viewed as an appellate justice? John replied in his typical high road, low-key, and self-effacing fashion the following. He said, I'd like to be remembered for having been, reasonably competent, a typical John thing, in doing what I did, that I undertook my responsibilities diligently and fairly, And certainly the impartiality, with the impartiality and objectivity that's expected of you in holding up the high standards of that office. And always, I think, with the highest commitment to ethical standards. I've always felt privileged to have been a member of the California judiciary, and the people I met and worked with, that has been really one of my rewards. That and the judge's pension. In closing, if John and Betty's old friend Rose Bird were here today, she probably would have concluded her remarks by singing that age-old folk song performed by everyone from Bob Dylan to the Grateful Dead. But I will just end by saying from that song, he was a friend of mine. Every time I think about him now, Lord, I just can't keep from crying because he was a friend of mine.
Please welcome Felicia Marcus, the Chair of the California Water Resources Control Board.
Thank you. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here with all of you, especially with Justice Racanelli's family. On behalf of the many of us who over the years have been engaged in the agonizing and critical task of balancing the competing interests in California water, and there are a few, particularly in the San Francisco Bay and Delta, I am honored to share just a few words about the profound impact that Justice Racanelli had on our lives and what he means not only to us, but really to our conception of ourselves as an evolving species, let alone water practitioners. Seriously. I want to start with a few words from Tina Cannon-Leahy, a longtime water lawyer currently at the State Water Board with us, because she states so well how many of us would summarize the key case, United States v. State Water Resources Control Board, that he's most known for in the water world and how we view it. Racanelli, as the decision came to be known, is required reading for California water law students. And like a great book, you pick it up again and again as you become an older and hopefully wiser water lawyer, and it means even more. It's the history of California water, the projects, the delta, water rights, water quality, and the evolution of the board. You also come to understand that those who were involved read like a who's who of outstanding legal minds, not just Justice Racanelli himself, but Tom Graff, Cliff Lee, Clem Shute, and others. And if you're really lucky, some of those names on a page become your friends and your peers. And finally, if you're fortunate enough to become a lawyer at the board and work on Delta issues, it continues to inspire. Quote, the board has the power and the duty to provide water quality protection to the fish and wildlife that make up the delicate ecosystem within the Delta and more that are all in that book. It's extraordinary. So these seem like very simple words, but for those of us who are water geeks, let alone lawyers, it would be impossible to overstate the importance of the Racanelli decision, not just for California water law, but for the evolution of societal views about the importance of the natural world to people. Historically, I think it'll be viewed as one of our evolutionary steps forward in our collective consciousness and as a species. Building on the earlier Supreme Court National Audubon public trust decision, it solidified the Water Board's authority and its duty to protect fish and wildlife as it sets water quality standards. It also made clear, and it becomes even clearer this is who he was from all of the speakers before me, it also made clear that the consideration of responsibility should apply in the context of the whole watershed, and not just to the water users who might be convenient and in front of you. It reminded us that our duty was to protect not only fish and wildlife, but all beneficial uses of water, and to keep that duty front and center as we did our jobs. It's really bigger picture thinking and a more modern and contemporary consciousness applied in a thoughtful and a very human way, which is exactly how the law is supposed to evolve. It's how we're supposed to evolve. We think of leaders as those who can give voice to things we know but haven't really articulated yet. He did that for us in a way that was plain spoken, clear, and unambiguous, which may just mean that Susan won the battle over Iraqis in part as we were doing it. Did a good job together as a team. To me, this is all a much bigger deal than just how smart he was, how accomplished he was, and how gracious he was. Though the latter's hard to overstate in my book as well. He was a giant, as a judge, as a mind, and as a human. You know, so many people go into their professions and they become a professional, and they shed a piece of their humanity, which is their greatest asset, as they become a lawyer, a doctor, a financier, or a judge, and we've all seen it happen. Justice Racanelli managed to retain that sense of wonder and grounding about why we are here and the power of people to make a difference in the world. His lens had grace, clarity, and what Lincoln had in mind when he called upon the better angels of our nature. He did it in his decisions. He did it by his actions in the volunteer world, and Grant Davis, now the DWR director and former Bay Institute executive director, vouches for him as a prince of a board member and a colleague. And he did it by how he touched so many people's lives with humor, with that clarity and grace and sense of fairness. His decision reminded us at the board that we were explicitly not just a water right adjudicator, but also a water quality protector under state law and California's very unique system of joining water rights and water quality, which was originally conceived by his colleague, Justice Roby, well before he took the bench. It was, frankly, this decision was a, you've got the power and the responsibility, use it kind of reminder. And he reminded us over and over again about how our considerable power was meant to be used, but meant to be used reasonably, which is as human a standard as anyone could ever dream of. The magic of the decision in our corner of the world is in its plain-spoken language, which was in essence, go for it, do your job, but is also in its recognition and acceptance of our responsibility to nature and its recognition of the importance of fairness to all. It seems obvious to a regular person, which in Yiddish does translate to mensch. According to my grandfather, he used to always talk about, gosh, he's great, he's just like a regular person, until I realized he was translating mensch all those years. It seems obvious to a regular person, but it seems less obvious to the expert warriors in the field, even despite the plain direction in the law. You know, sure, he was interpreting the language of statutes, and sure, those were words written by the legislature and by preceding jurists, but trust me, just having those words in statute does not give them life and does not make things happen. In our case, the former board didn't see the same meaning, that same direction, that same challenge, or that same authority and responsibility, and it took Justice Racanelli's decision to frame it in ways that could be clear to any human reading it. You know, there are other decisions about our responsibility to protect fish and wildlife, and some of them are even poetic and very well written. But there is only one of them referred to by its author's name, the Racanelli decision, or in conversation, just Racanelli. Racanelli says, Racanelli directs. It's like we need a little bobblehead or something that talks to tell us. I mean, people are talking about Racanelli as a decision, but there aren't any other decisions that are called by somebody's name, by the judge's name in our world. And it's because of the core humanity in that decision that you can feel a kinship to it, and you can feel the power of it without anything flowery. It's in its clarity. And I'll be honest, we're still struggling to actually do it, and do it well and faithfully, both the protecting the fish and wildlife part and the allocate responsibility fairly part, because it's difficult. This year's a particularly busy year for us as we try to bring the planning part of a horribly overdue update across the finish line. But if we're lucky, we'll feel Justice Racanelli sitting at our side, encouraging us to do the right things and the fair things, the way a thoughtful, compassionate, complex, and reasonable human would want us to, as opposed to what the warring parties in front of us want us to, all within the bounds, direction, and spirit of the law, of course. And we are all the better for having had us in our lives and in our orbit, and maybe hopefully a little further along on our evolutionary path because of his influence. So our greatest sympathies and our equally heartfelt thanks to his wonderful family from the bottom of all of our hearts for sharing his magic with us. Thank you.
I'm I'm sorry to tell you that we will not hear from Felton Henderson, the retired federal district court judge who is unable to be with us today. But will you please welcome Mary Louise Frampton, former executive director of the Felton Henderson Center for Social Justice at UC Berkeley's Law School, and now director of the Aoki Center of Critical Race and Nation Studies at UC Davis Law School.
John has a very special place in my heart, as I know he does in all of yours. Because above all else, he was a joyful man. And his zest for life was so infectious that we were all happier people because of him. I met John almost 3.5 decades ago, not as a judge, but as the man who had captivated the heart of my dear friend Betty. So of course I knew that he was a brilliant jurist whose opinions managed to balance analytical rigor with a keen awareness of the impact of his decision on individuals. And that was a good sign, but I didn't really care about that. What I cared about was whether he deserved Betty. Could his mind match Betty's crackling intelligence? Could his embrace of the world, his passion for other people, ever match Betty's intellectual curiosity? Did he have the self-confidence to regard Betty's profession as equal to his? Could he celebrate her very significant accomplishments as his own? And of course, John being John, he managed to surpass my hard test almost immediately. And I soon discovered that although he was dedicated to the law and excelled at it, it wasn't his life. His life was Betty and his children and the wider world. So I was really privileged to witness the over 3-decade love affair of Betty and John. My late husband was the judge who married them. I was Betty's attendant. And then John was the judge who married Scott and me. Betty stood up for me. Our children became fond of each other. And to this day, even though all of these children are now in middle age, my children still refer to the Racanelli children as the teenagers. So over the years, back and forth between San Francisco and New York, we remained close, and John and Betty's wise counsel were really instrumental in establishing first the Almost Lecture at Bolt Hall, and later in nurturing the Henderson Center for Social Justice to honor Judge Felton Henderson, who was a judge so much like John. Brilliant, principled, courageous, fiercely principled. Others have talked about John's opinions. I just want to say a moment about what he did in his retirement. That instead of continuing to mediate and adjudicate the kinds of cases he had on the court, he focused on ensuring that individuals in the Black farmers case received the damages that they deserved. That was his focus, because racial justice was really at his core. A few weeks ago, as Betty and I were sitting in New York, and she was telling me about John's last days, I thought how fitting it was that he died because his heart
filled up so much that his body could not sustain it. So that he died as he lived, with an overflowing heart.
Our next speaker, Raj Mathai, is both family and friend. He's the son of the husband of John's first wife, Sally Mathai, the mother of John's children. Raj is also a journalist and an anchor on KNTV.
Good evening. It's great to be here with everyone here at Hastings, so close to Judge Racanelli's heart, and back in San Francisco, where his heart always remained. Thank you for the description. My name is Raj Mathai. And yes, technically I am, how did you say it? I haven't even figured it out after all these years. Unofficially, we'll start with that. I am his fourth son, but nothing weird here, no scandal. But I'm the unofficial son. Technically speaking, though, yes, it is his first wife's new husband's son who immigrated from India in 1977. So if you want further clarification, I'm happy to chat with you in the cocktail hour. Judge Racanelli, to me, is three parts. He's part father figure, he's part mentor, and he's part sponsor. And the word sponsor to me is a big deal because everyone, regardless of the color of your skin or your income level, of your family's income level, or your education level, you need a sponsor to get up in life. And he was that person to me, to open doors and to open eyes. And he did that for me tremendously. And it comes down, I've said the story, it comes down to one football game for me. And when I came here in the late 70s from India, all I wanted to be was a sportscaster. And back in the 80s, there were no Indian sportscasters, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be a sportscaster. And I get this phone call in January 1986, and I'm in Los Altos, our home down the peninsula here, and it's Judge Racanelli. And he says, "Hey, what are you doing Sunday?" And I said, "Well, why is this guy asking me what I'm doing Sunday? Everyone knows what we're doing Sunday. The 49ers are playing the Dolphins at Stanford Stadium in the Super Bowl." And I said, "Well, Judge Racanelli, I'm watching the game." And he goes, "Oh, yeah, would you like to watch it with me?" I'm thinking, why do I want to go to his house and watch the football game? He goes, "I have 2 tickets. I'd like to take you to the game at Stanford Stadium." I said, wow. So there I was, Stanford Stadium, Sunday afternoon in January of 1986, me, 14 years old, and Judge Racanelli. And in front of us is senators and state representatives and district attorneys and actors and comedians and everything. This was 50-yard line seats, amazing. And I think the first couple of people said, "Hey, Judge, who you with? Who's the kid?" And he said, "Oh, it's my ex-wife's new husband," that whole thing. And I think finally the third guy to ask him said, "Judge, who's your," and he got tired of it. He goes, "That's my son." So I think I was from southern Italy, where the skin's really dark. But that game, obviously it was a huge game, but that game just gave me confidence and opened my eyes and gave me a belief in myself that I could do this crazy dream that I wanted to do. And years later, I finally got my dream. I became that sportscaster for NBC, and I remember talking to him, and he said, "Congratulations." And I asked him, I go, "Why'd you take me to that game? Why not Chris and Johnny and Tom and Lori or Carrie or anyone else? Why'd you take me?" And my middle name's Yakub. And he said, "Well, Yakub, those kids of mine never wanted to go into law. You were my last chance." So it's great to be here at Hastings, isn't it? Now I'm no longer a sportscaster, but I'm in general news now, and it's funny how things come around because, especially in this last year at NBC, we've done so many investigations with our drought on water rights, who's trying to skirt the system, who's trying to manipulate the system, and who's not obeying the system at all, and it all comes back to that Racanelli decision. So the upside, I'm not a lawyer, but we still cover so much of what's close to his heart, and being a part of this family and with Betty here as a journalist, we're tight now, so we're good. And I love Betty just as much as I love Judge Racanelli. And in closing, I still feel he's with us because I have the privilege to be my siblings, and I say that. I still see Judge Racanelli in them, in the social activism and just the passion for life. So thank you all for being here and allowing me to speak as well. Thank you.
Drew mentioned, and some of you know, that John in retirement played a very important role with another group of judges in convincing President Obama to make a change in the long and unhappy relationship with Cuba. But you may not know that he had a very personal reason for being so interested. On a trip to Cuba, John had jumped in the swimming pool of this rather modest hotel where they were staying and immediately had a piercing pain in his ear. And so he remembered that his mother would use some kind of eardrops for such a situation. And so he presented himself at the front desk of this hotel and asked if there were a pharmacy nearby where he might get some of these eardrops. Well, this was Cuba, of course. So they told him, well, there's a doctor here in the hotel who will see you. And so John went in, and the doctor took a look in his ear and let loose with an, "Ay, caramba," and motioned his assistant over, who took a look and let loose with another, "Ay, caramba." They proceeded to remove a very large piece of earwax from John's ear. The rest of his trip went swimmingly, so to speak. He went back home and just happened to have an appointment with his ear, eye, nose doctor on Monday and found that he had perfect hearing after his trip to Cuba. So it was the least he could do. And now one of the great journalists of our time, a former reporter for the Washington Post, the author of not only Framed, but Winds of Change, Women at Work, and most recently, the truly amazing book, The Burglary, John's wife, Betty Metzger.
Thank you, Ray. I just want you to know that if I have a problem getting through this, I have a standby ready to help. Your words today have just been amazing. The eloquence, the wisdom, and the tenderness about John. So just thank you so much. I owe John thanks for many things. Second only to my deep gratitude that we spent our lives together for many years is the thanks I owe him for introducing me into this extraordinary family whom you met today. A real life-changing thing for me. Especially wonderful has been the gift of watching 6 grandchildren find their places in the world and watching them become interesting, engaged, and loving people. This has been a great thing that both of us cherished during the last decades. Throughout our years together, family and friends have been as important to John and me as the air we breathed, and as many people here today have suggested, as the pasta we ate. It is very special to be here today with so many old friends and former colleagues of both of us. And despite the very sad circumstances that bring us together, it nevertheless feels like a homecoming, one that John would have deeply loved. At the beginning of our shared life, which happened right in this area, it would have been difficult to predict that someday people would gather to celebrate the long life of John Racanelli. John was pessimistic then about how long he would live, something that really surprised me. He told me from the beginning that he thought he only had 5 more years to live. He was only 57 at the time. I thought that was strange. I kept reminding him that the chances were great that he would live a long life. After all, the Racanelli family had legendary longevity genes. His father, John, had died recently at 91. His mother, Marianne, was well on her way to 95, the age she was when she died. One day in that summer of 1982, when we were first together, John told me that he had told one of his colleagues that day about his good new relationship, our relationship. He said he also had told the colleague, another judge, that he regretted that it might not be a long relationship, that he thought he had only 5 years to live. The colleague, John said, well, remember, you can do a lot in 5 years. And we did do a lot in 5 years. And then 5 more years. And the 5-year segments kept adding up. He stopped saying he thought he had only 5 more years to live. I think he stopped at about age 70. I think he realized finally by age 70 that those Racanelli genes were working for him. We had 35 years together, and to be honest, we were greedy. We wanted more. But together, we did realize that we were lucky. And even now, I realize that indeed, we were very lucky. John touched countless people. Thousands of people who didn't know him felt the impact of his judicial opinions, which you've got a glimpse of already from some of the very eloquent remarks that have been made. And the rest of us, family and friends, had the great luck of being close to him. People who have been in touch since John died have described him as thoughtful, bright, passionate, funny, warm-hearted, all true. Perhaps the greatest tribute to John is to say that the qualities that made him a wonderful friend, son, father, grandfather, and husband also made him a deeply respected judge and later, in his retirement, an effective activist. As Governor Brown, the second Governor Brown, and the third, I guess, Jerry appointed John to the State Court of Appeals in 1977, and whose father, Pat, appointed him to the Superior Court in San Jose in 1964. But as Jerry said when John died, John was a thoughtful judge who cared about people and did his part to right wrongs and ensure that justice was administered fairly and with a sense of compassion. A friend recently said he had intelligence, humor, goodness, integrity. He had them all without any sort of show-off. Evidence of that last point would be that he would be surprised and absolutely delighted that all of us came together to celebrate his life as we are doing today. For me, life with John was a daily pleasure. During the majority of our years together, we worked in the same room, side by side, on our separate projects. And thanks to that 24/7 proximity, we engaged in a continuous conversation about what mattered to us. We had many adventures. Most were small, charming adventures, such as the bicycle trips that we took, including with some friends who are here today, Betsy and Ken, Ginge and Tom. We had requirements. We biked only in flat places. And the highlight of each day which after some of the remarks you won't be surprised at. The highlight of each day was the dinner at the end of the trail and the hours-long conversations around the table with the friends who were cycling with us. We probably could have been in the Guinness Book of Records for being the only people who gained weight on long bicycle trips. That's us, not Ken and Betsy, and not Ginge and Tom. There were larger adventures. One that touched us deeply was going to South Africa. The first trip there took place soon after Nelson Mandela was released from prison. We experienced the extreme hopes and fears that were part of daily life there then. The friendships that developed on that and another trip to South Africa were deep and meaningful, continuing to today, and put South Africa in our hearts forever. I want to acknowledge a few people. First, a huge thanks to UC Hastings College of Law for hosting this celebration of John's life. Karen and I are particularly grateful to Danica Valencia, who has been extremely helpful to us through every step of our planning. Hastings is the perfect place to celebrate John. He was a very proud graduate of Hastings. He graduated from here in 1952. Later, he had connections here that were very enjoyable. After retiring from the bench in 1991, he taught legal ethics at Hastings. He also served on the administrative committee of the college's annual Matthew Tabriner Memorial Lecture. And that brings me to some people that I wanted to draw attention to, people who were particularly dear to John. Joe has mentioned Justice Tabriner. Justice Tabriner was a very special person, a giant among many outstanding people who have served on California's appellate courts throughout the state's history. And for John, Justice Tabriner was a much admired and beloved mentor. He also had high regard for his colleagues on Division I of the Court of Appeal. Four of him, I think, are here today, beginning with Joe, Bill Newsom, Bill Stein, and Bob Dosey. We're honored here today by the presence of John's loving brother, Joe, and his wife, Myrna, and many members of the extended Racanelli family. It is wonderful to have you here. I want to mention someone else, actually three more people who meant a lot to John. I received a message yesterday from Bill O'Brien, a longtime friend. And he sent me a message saying that, as he put it, there's some good news about John today. And that is that he was sure that John and Cookie were smiling over a beer. Now, Cookie Pachetti is someone known only to lawyers of a certain age. And I think there are some in the room. Cookie was the proprietor of the Star Buffet, a bar near the old courthouse in San Francisco that was a friendly hangout for lawyers, police officers, and others for decades. John went there as a young lawyer shortly after he graduated from Hastings, and then again when he came back to sit on the Court of Appeal. Cookie held a special place in John's heart. And it was Cookie and two other people, his very close friend, the late Bob Peckham, a federal judge, and Bob's wife, Carol, who is with us today. Those three people were among the first people he wanted me to meet. And now I have a request. Any time is a bad time to be sick. For John and many other people, this year, I think, was a particularly bad time to be sick.
Throughout that time, he was aware of the crises that were unfolding in the country. Erna has spoken about John's ever-present optimism, and that was true throughout his life, and even in the past year as he was quite sick. He was optimistic throughout that time about his own condition. But it was a special year, and during that time, he had a keen sense of despair in the last months of his life about what was happening to the country. He felt that what he had given most of his life to, working to create more justice, equality, and protection for people and for the earth, the air, and the water, was being turned back, that it even was being destroyed. Here's my request, that each of us, in honor of John and in the interest of justice, do everything we can to keep from becoming paralyzed in the face of injustices being perpetrated. That we try to remember that each of us can make a difference, as he certainly did. That we can make a difference even when that seems impossible. Finally, I have the pleasure of introducing a friend, Lloyd Francis. He is a photographer, a writer, and, in the capacity in which you will see him today, a musician. The New York celebration of John's life took place just a few days before he would have turned 92. We closed the celebration there with a friend, author Janet Bell, widow of the great constitutional law scholar Derek Bell, leading the audience in a song that celebrated John. I decided that his California friends should not be deprived of the opportunity to celebrate him in song, and invited Lloyd and his band, Platinum OG, to lead us in doing that. Lloyd.
I was like, where? Take your time.
Thank you, Betty, for that great introduction. I'm really honored to be here tonight with Platinum OG, and I just want to take a chance to introduce the band to you. On the drums tonight, on percussion, we have Brian Wiley, a good friend of mine. On the flute, we have the incomparable and world-famous Top Cat. And playing bass today is my son, Waylon Francis. I want you guys to feel free to join me in singing. You know, it doesn't make much sense. There ought to be a law against anyone who takes offense at a day in your celebration, 'cause we all know in our minds there ought to be a time and I'm sure you would agree. It could fit perfectly than to have a world party on the day it came to be. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. I just never stood how a man who died for good could not have a day that would be set aside for his recognition and dream could there be that they should not heresy just because it never should be that dream before it becomes an illusion. And we all know everything that we stood for time would bring for a peace of heart to sing. Come and join me with Martin Luther King. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Oh, why has there never been a holiday where peace is celebrated all around the world? Time's overdue for people like me and you who know the way to truth is love and unity to all God's children, and it should be a great event. That whole day should be spent and in full remembrance of those who lived and died for the oneness of all people. So let us all begin. We all that we can win. Listen, how to zone it in. Sing it as loud as you can. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. We know that the key to unity of all people is in the dream that you heard so long ago. It lives in the hearts of all of us people. John will be there forever. Do not forget, and do not ever get discouraged, because today is the day to celebrate John's life. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm sure, Betty, thank you very much for being you.
Thank you for joining us. We'd ask you to keep your seats now as Betty and the family move into the reception next door. And after they're on their way, we invite you to join us. If you haven't had your parking validated yet, I'm told there's still a stand where you can do that. Please join us for refreshments next door. Thank you again. Thank you very much. Beautiful.